So back in late 2004, I'd recently returned to Johannesburg, my hometown, after, as Eric said, a year backpacking through the jungles of South America and almost a decade living overseas, mostly in New York, but also in Berlin and Los Angeles and Tel Aviv. I was working for OMM Design Workshop and Urban Solutions and on the Constitutional Court buildings in Braamfontein. And I got this opportunity to design a small bar at called Fuel Cafe in Newtown. And the brother of a friend of mine had recently bought an apartment on Louis Botha Avenue and wanted it turned into a New York-style loft. And this evening I want to tell you a bit about the journey since I decided to quit my day job and take on 2 small projects and try to build my own practice. Assembling the material for this talk has been a really interesting exercise. For me, it feels like I've had my head down following this process for a little over a decade now. And this has given me the opportunity to zoom out a little bit and to look at the work as a kind of collective and to try and make sense of it. I came across this essay by Zvi Berlin, the great 20th century thinker, and it's called The Hedgehog and the Fox. And the conceptual framework for this essay comes from a saying attributed to the Greek poet Archilochus, where he says that the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. And I think what he's saying here is that the fox has many strategies which it uses to survive, but the hedgehog has only one. But it is one very effective strategy. And I'm interested what this sort of categorization reveals about our attitudes. The material I've been looking at for this talk has got me wondering which category my practice might fall into. Do the principles, mechanisms, and strategies which we've used hint at which side of this divide we're on? Are we hedgehog or fox? A quick caveat, and it seems a bit redundant to say this to a room full of architects, but what we do is highly collaborative. Employees and professional teams and clients and contractors, family and friends, they all play a role in shaping the buildings that the architect supposedly authors. And these are the we that I'm referring to in this talk. So, like any good startup in 2005, we set up Gregory Katz Architecture in the garage of our house with 2 tiny projects on the books. I worked part-time trading rough diamonds to supplement the meager earnings from the practice. And this infographic, it shows all the projects that we've worked on since inception. It's a chronological representation. And the larger the font size, the larger the project. The darker the font, the greater the learnings were on that project. It's quite interesting to see that some of the smaller projects are quite dark. And in the blue band across the top are all the projects that didn't materialize, and the pink block at the bottom right are the projects that we're currently busy with in the office. There's roughly 100 projects here, and there's about 40 in that band along the top, so our hit rate's roughly like 60-40, which sounds terrible, but the architects in this room will know that's quite normal. So for this talk, I'm going to concentrate on the largest and darkest of the text here on the list of the built work, and then I'll talk a little bit about the work we're currently busy with in the office. I'll start with this one. I call this project 3 of a kind. It came about because I'd found these 3 adjacent plots in Norwood, and I was looking to generate some work for the practice. And so I approached a developer, and we collaborated to build these 3 identical spec homes on the property. We came to an arrangement that in lieu of fees, I would be allowed to buy one of these units at cost, And I reckon this was quite a shrewd move on the part of the developer because it really forced me to keep a close eye on the bottom line I'd be paying for the house. And as you can see, they're made almost entirely out of concrete. And we had a very experienced specialist concrete contractor on the job. And together we optimized the scale and the size and the design and the construction sequence of these 3 identical boxes so that we could get the maximum reuse of the formwork. This efficiency of scale meant that we could afford to buy brand new shutters for the job and instead of hiring them. And that was the biggest factor in achieving this very smooth, close to perfect concrete finish. There was no chasing of services into the walls. All the services, all the conduits, all the draw boxes had to be precisely pre-planned and shown on elevational drawings so that they could be positioned in the walls before the pour. So we had to be quite thorough. I lived in this house for 10 years, and I loved that house. This house, we had all 3 of our children there. But it's also a big reckoning living in a place that you've designed. You're confronted by your blind spots almost every day. So that was a big learning. And another learning on the project was that having an open-minded client and a really professional builder on a job goes a long way to ensuring the success of a project. I call this one Inhabit the Boundary Wall. It's a house on a subdivided tennis court. It's one of a series of houses that we did at the time where we were very interested in pushing the building to the very edges of the site. This meant that we could eliminate the inefficiency of having a separate boundary wall. And the Joburg Town Planning Scheme actually makes provision for this. And it's surprising to me that this is not a more pervasive typology, given our penchant for boundary walls in this town. So the angular parallelogram-shaped garage has to do with parking cars at 45 degrees, but it also has to do with the overall defensive strategy of the house, in that the garage is wider on the x-axis and shorter on the y-axis, so it forms a kind of buffer zone across the site. There's an in and an out. It's a coachman's driveway with a cottage on the street, so that cottage then comes to replace that boundary wall on the street. And being shorter on the y-axis frees up space for a series of courtyards along the length of this property. I think that the figure ground diagram is quite beautiful here. It really illustrates the strategy, the planning strategy quite well. We used polished black pigmented terrazzo concrete flooring, and the stairs are made of salvaged shutters from the site, which we profile cut and then sandwiched together to make one big block. That wall is breeze block, which we plastered and then cut very carefully so that it forms a kind of perforated surface. This project I call Shifting Goalposts. So in early 2010, we were commissioned to design a clubhouse for the five-a-side soccer courts at the Wanderers Club. It was a high-profile project for a high-profile sponsor, and it had to be ready to open in June in time for the World Cup. This gave us roughly 2 months to design it, do all the procurement, get all the approvals, and then roughly a 4-month construction window. So it was very tight. The building is a simple double-volume rectangle on a raised terraforce plinth. We ran several planning scenarios, and we found that the quickest way to build was not actually using all ready-made construction technology, but to create a kind of composite structure of in situ cast concrete columns, steel beams, echo slabs, and then glazed infill. That blue band across the top is polycarbonate and announces the building to Corlett Drive, and also has to do with the sponsor's colors. It's quite simply planned. There's services running along the south, and then a nice viewing area which overlooks the soccer courts. And so this building is all about seeing out. So it's highly transparent. All those doors are operable, and there's a band of glazed windows along upper story of the mezzanine level all along the southern side. So the building is set up for optimal conditions for passive natural ventilation when all the doors are open and the windows are open. But what happens when your client refuses to open the doors for security reasons? It's quite nice in the winter when the season's cold, but in the summer it gets pretty hot. And the lesson here was that it's quite difficult to predict how your client's going to use their building. We were so focused on getting this thing finished on time and on budget, which we did manage to do, but we never had this one very important conversation. This project I call future-proofing. Here we were approached by a young couple who were just starting out, and they wanted us to build their first home. And the brief was to design a one-bedroom home which they could then add to over time as their space requirements grew when they had kids. And we proposed that they put up a concrete frame, and then we'd finish off the ground floor, and as over time they could then populate the upper story, fill it in, and move up there. So the planning's really simple. Quite challenging engineering cantilevers here. It's cantilevering in 2 directions. There's the frame going up. The client's an electrical engineer, so he was kind of obsessed with the conduits and making sure there was enough conduits. It also speaks quite nicely to this idea of future-proofing. So this project I call Love Thy Neighbor. If we flash back to that infographic that I showed you towards the beginning, around 2013, 2014, you'd see a big gap. And that's when the global economic recession hit our practice pretty hard. And once again, I was hustling for work. And so I was looking for development opportunities and pitching this to investors. And one of them resulted in this project, which is a small housing development of 9 terrace houses, clusters, on long, narrow stands, each with their own courtyard and a large garden. Each pair of units shares an entranceway. We were quite excited by the compositional potential of this long street-facing elevation. So apart from providing architectural services for this job, the investor insisted that I throw all the fees into the pot as well as my life savings, and in exchange I'd be made an equal partner in the deal, and this seemed like a really attractive deal at the time. I'd never really appreciated the effect that delays have on a project's profitability, and now with skin in the game, as they say, I understood why developers seem to have this extreme impatience on projects. This is what a unicorn looks like. It's called a Regulation 38 certificate. Those of you who have ever tried to subdivide a property will know what I'm talking about. The town planning process here was like something out of a Kafka novel. Neighbors objected. People in key positions at council were either permanently on leave or absent or deliberately obstructive. My balls were in a vice for 3 years. As an architect, we were able to maintain this healthy distance from the financial pressures and day-to-day management of our projects, but this was different. Just last week, I got a call from one of the buyers to say that their fridge had packed up. It's like 2 years after they'd moved in, and could I help them? Another learning from this project is to always build up the slope, and if you want to know what I mean, then come and ask me after the lecture. I call this project Broad Brushstrokes. This was a new corporate headquarters for a metals recycling business. It's a family-owned and run business, and the purse strings are tightly controlled. During our briefing, the clients were deeply suspicious of architects, who they thought were out to waste their hard-earned cash on unnecessary decorative flourishes. Our challenge was to deliver a building that was dead simple and yet had a clear, strong identity. The site's an extremely dusty scrapyard, so Facebook was an obvious choice for its low maintenance, robust quality, and it's applied in a taut, reveal-less skin so that it's easy to hose down. So we were very interested in the expressive potential of patterning the brick by using various colors of brick, and we did several studies, and ultimately we settled on this one because the more intricate patterns tended to push up labor costs, and the client only agreed to go this route if we could prove to him that it didn't cost any more than a uniform face brick box. Also, in our effort to minimize wastage, the banding, the patterns are determined and calibrated by the number of bricks that fit on a pallet and the number of pallets that fit on the back of a delivery truck. It's an elevational study, an unfolded elevation, just showing the quantities. And also to achieve that sort of chamfered form that you saw, we've used these special sill bricks, these canted bricks, so that you get a kind of seamless finish. Corrobrick had to fire up some of their old molds to get those. This is a kindergarten. I call it fun with blocks. There were several strategies which informed the design here. Scale is an important consideration when designing for little people. So users access the site from an elevated level. So you come in at eye level with the upper story here, so it mitigates that looming scale. And then you descend to the entrance via a slide, which you see to the right of the little girl there, or by the seating stairs. We were very fortunate to have a broad north-facing site. So we could accommodate all the classrooms on a single level and all have equal access to sunlight and to the playground. The upper story houses therapy rooms and other auxiliary functions. So a feature of this project was the exhaustive use of these off-the-shelf precast concrete frames. And we exploited the wide variety of shapes and sizes that are available. There's something like 40 different variations. And we varied their position relative to the ground plane, obviously for playful effect, but more importantly, this has to do with the variation in eye line between an adult and a child. We also used the frames to create these chunky, porous columns along the north-facing colonnade. Each column has a completely different configuration of frames and colored inserts. So that each column is completely unique, and the kids really love them. They climb on them and through them. And as you walk down the passage, the colored panes of glass align and combine in different ways. So it's kind of like this interactive lesson in color combination. We stockpiled all the rubble from the building that we needed to demolish on the site, and we crushed it and we used it to make these mounds and a kind of Teletubby-esque landscape in the playground. That's a really good way of making curbing there on the right. It's an extrusion process. Shot here on the top right of the sandpit, and developed this sandpit cover that could be lowered at night to protect the sand and then raised up during the day to provide some shade. We were quite into making everything quite chunky. The library was conceived as a kind of rocky terrain that kids would climb on and explore and look around for books and find them in all sorts of unusual places, even in the floor. I call this one House 2.0. Just last year, we completed this home for our family. We also built a new studio for my practice and my wife's Alexander technique practice. That's the building in the foreground here. The house has a concrete frame with coffered slabs, and the infill are clay brick specials. This is quite an interesting story here that I was walking around the Corrobrick yard, and we came across this like huge pile of these special shaped bricks, and they'd just been lying there gathering dust for years. And there were about 13,000 of these, they're called plinth stretchers, and Corrobrick didn't know what to do with them, so I took them off their hands before I ran a brick. This is why I tell the students to get out from behind their computers. You never know what you might find out there. It's a very simple plan. It's all centered around a fireplace, and there's a sort of split-level playroom, and then upstairs are all the bedrooms. There's a triangular pool. You can see it's half out the ground and half in the ground. That's the big blue front door. And that's not protective tape on the window frames. That's the actual color of the window frames. We used an imported plywood for the kitchen, and the floors are a blue vinyl on a sort of chevron angle at a diagonal. That's the raised playroom. The concrete stairs have a bush-hammered finish, and the main bedroom and bathroom share a space. You can see the coffered ceilings, and that's the big triangular pool with the cheesy shot of me and Karen standing. That's the studio. It's a light steel structure with a rubber shingle cladding, which is normally used to cover roofs, but we applied it here on the walls. I really love this product. It's very, very versatile. Because it's flexible, it takes up all those complicated details, at the eaves, and there you see the studio going up. That's what it feels like inside the office. There's a nice big door facing the park. Sorry, it's a window, the size of a door. Now for some of the work we're currently busy with in the office, just a small sampling. This is our shape sorter house. And you enter behind this giant triangle. There are several Roman arches at different scales and heights. There's a diamond-shaped void and a corresponding skylight. The footprint is exactly 10 by 10. So I think Jonah Arrow would approve, for those of you who attended his talk. We're building it out of clay pavers, and they have a great scale. They're much narrower than normal bricks. They're only 50 millimeters. And they have these nibs on them which are used to space them, so we're facing those outwards so we get this interesting texture. This is a high-density apartment building that we're busy with in the Joburg CBD. And as you can see, it has these wavy corridors. They're really generously proportioned. They range from 2 meters wide to as much as 5 meters wide. And we're very interested in this becoming a kind of social condenser for the building. People will move through the space, but also inhabit it on a daily basis. And to encourage activity there, we're sinking a borehole and capturing rainwater and then feeding it to wash troughs that sit on the chamfered corners there. There's a series of wash troughs on every story, and these become communal laundry areas. And it's in an attempt to really activate that space. And we're building in wash lines, and we're quite excited about the potential of all this laundry, this colorful laundry and the wavy slab edges, and making a kind of giant art installation out of this courtyard. This is in a similar way here, but on a kind of bit of a smaller scale and for a bit more upmarket clientele. This is a high-density scheme, and we're interested once again in having these very broad public communal areas that double up as the circulation for the building. We've sort of repeated the ground floor on every level here. Here's the plan. The figure ground's quite interesting, I think. We have a number of projects along the Louis Botha BRT route, and it's been really incredible to see the powerful effect that legislation of increased densities has had on the market. It's really opened up a lot of opportunities for developers and consequently for us. This project is on the old Dollhouse site. The density here is about 300 dwelling units per hectare, so there's about 120 of these units. They're quite small, they're one-bedroom units, about 17 square meters each. And we've really enjoyed the kind of pixelated scale of this project because the units are so small. You can have quite a bit of fun with modulating the facade, but that modulation then carries through to the interior courtyard. And it's not these straight runs of passageways. Everything has a kind of vibrancy to it because of the jagged edges. Quite a mission to line up all the plumbing through ducts with a building like that. Now I want to talk a bit about the GSA. I've been teaching here for 2 years now. I teach a unit loosely titled Methods and Materials, where we focus on research. The focus of our research, should I say, is on how we make our buildings. We're looking for new ways. And we use physical models and then we test them. And deciding to teach has been, and being part of this faculty, has been such a highlight for me. Had it appeared on that infographic that I showed at the beginning, it would have been amongst the largest and darkest of the of the items on that list. Here's a sample of the work. So this is one student who was very interested in thatching and actually spent a few months in the field getting his hands dirty. And then we did some tests with thatch, and some of them were quite counterintuitive, but had very interesting results. You know, we took a small sample of thatch and bound it together and applied some vertical loads to it, did these tests, and turned out that thatch is actually quite strong when it's bound like this. It came back results of like 14 MPa, which is like 3 times stronger than the average brick. And it has to do something with the engineers could explain a lot better than I could, but it has something to do with the fact that thatch grows in various thicknesses. They are small and thick pieces of thatch, and when you bundle them together, they act in a kind of aggregate fashion, similar to concrete. The small pieces fit in between the larger ones, and then we try to make blocks out of the thatch and developed a kind of baler for it. This student was looking at a very ancient building technique, rammed earth, but quite interested in updating it and molding it in disposable bins, you know, these like plastic Addis bins, and coming up with an architecture for that. And another student who was, he wanted to reinvent the way that we make our buildings so that we could demolish them more efficiently. So he invented a block that had a dovetail joint and then could slide together or be taken apart quite easily. And this is an injection molded product using similar technology to the way that bottle crates are made, and similar proportions to that as well. Student looking at bioplastics. These are really interesting materials. She was making them on her kitchen stove at home. They have really interesting properties, and they're completely biodegradable. The student was looking at trying to fashion a new building cladding out of recycled milk cartons that he bisected and then laminated together in a low-temperature oven to make a very realistic, viable product, I thought. And here the student was looking at quite old methods of weaving, you know, vernacular weaving, African weaves, and then a one-to-one scale, upscaling of that research, where he's weaving now flexible electrical conduit and then filling it with reinforced concrete. Also quite viable, I felt. So, yeah, it's been a bit challenging, balancing family and running a practice and pursuing these academic interests, but the benefits are commensurate. As far as I know, there's no other institution on the continent which runs the unit system where part-time staff are accommodated and nurtured. And this affords an exciting crossover between the field and the academy. We are afforded this scope for brave, abstract experimental thinking and robust intellectual debate that is very different to the kind of thinking that one does running a practice. Being surrounded by colleagues of the intellectual caliber and that we have here, the conversations, the ideas, the feedback, the critical thinking, it keeps you sharp. Working through questions with students forces me to make sense of things. To me, the university offers this really pure, abstract environment and lends itself to bold, hedgehog-like thinking. But in the field, there's so many variables that one's responding to, one needs to be a bit more foxy. This quote by Calvino, I don't know, seems to suggest the opposite, but we can debate that. Either way, I feel like we are a hybrid, a fox-hog. And it may not be pretty, but it's a lot more interesting. Thank you, that's all.